like, those aren't.
All right, I'm hitting record. Yeah, so these are I'm just showing you, this is the instance that I'm testing on. And so I do see a certain number of errors, but the errors that I'm seeing, I don't think are the same kinds of errors that you're seeing. Um,
And
most,
so I'll populate them more. The one thing I did want to ask was if the error to pending conversion, like I know that happens every night, to if that is something that is configurable, because at least for now, I guess we could like look at it, see if we're able to fix it quickly. If not, that would be something that I would consider changing to like every 3 days, even, because I do feel like the error, or at least before we'll be able to see we were getting about 10,000 repositories going to error and then back to pending every night. And so I think that could be part of the reason why secondary is so far behind on collection, because there's like 10,000 repositories getting recollected on every day in core, because of the error to back to pending state. And so, yeah, that would be like one of my questions, if that's something that is configurable. And this is not that big of an issue, but whenever we rebuild the last two releases, um, it's pretty much like started to rebuild, broke itself down, and then built again. And so it works, but those are what the offline is. Don't worry about that. It's pretty much the same thing that it is before. It's just it's tracking. It's that Flower has not restarted in the last time within the same amount of time that um
yeah,
Augur has.
that's a Docker. There's something in the way that Flower is operating on Docker that needs to be addressed. Yeah, you are
I mean,
seeing,
it's not. It's just that it's not being like I can just reset. I can just reset. It's just that Augur has been broken down and put like has been restarted in a shorter amount of time than Flower has.
yeah, and that's something that we have to sort of look into the Docker configuration to organize, because in the bare metal version, that's the other one that we have running, that is, I mean, that Flower gets shut down when Augur gets shut down. It's just, as far as the bare metal is concerned, it's just another Augur process, and so Flower dies when Augur dies. And
Oh yeah.
I think Greg has Flower set up as a separate container, and so there's something about the container sequencing that we'll need to look
It's
into there.
yeah. I mean, that to me is like so low on the priority list. Like
Uh,
it
no,
doesn't impact.
yeah, so I definitely see on your instance here how we're still having this issue with the events,
Yeah.
which is what we thought we had patched over the weekend. And you can see, if I go over here, the things that are erroring over here are mostly not that. And so I have to, so the question really becomes kind of instance specific to try to understand why that's still failing. And when you're, so when you're shutting down the containers, if everything is shut down, you are rebuilding Augur.
Yes. Um.
Yeah.
Yes, it is rebuilding. I'd go the if you click into each one, it's pretty. It goes into it gives you the error, and I think most of them I've seen, the error is the exact
No, these are,
same.
so the error that we identified was that there is a logic that we have to pick up event and message collection inside of Augur from the place where it was last successful, so that we don't recollect things that have already been collected. And I think Andrew's pretty sure, and I am as well, that the way that we reset the collection status table on your instance had caused that logic to fail, because it looked as though that the events had not been previously collected when clearly they have.
And now there's having a collision of ID.
Yeah, so what is puzzling is that it's continuing. So that's the part um
Yeah, the
that we have
logic
to,
makes sense. It just sounds
and
like
it's
what was done that
and
didn't
this
fix
is
it.
yeah, this is the constraint that's being violated. So it's not our identifier that's duplicate. It is the identifier generated by um, uh, the identifier of the event itself inside of the platform, either GitHub or GitLab. So
I mean, and it makes sense because I mean, the logic follows that if there's no date in the last core collected by, it assumes that nothing's been collected, but there has been things collected. And
exactly.
so now, and so now we have to figure out, okay.
No, and
So
the part that's a little bit puzzling to me is, and I'll have to talk to Andrew about this because he did the patch, but he recognized the issue. He thought the patch that he provided would fix the issue, which essentially, if it encountered a duplicate, it would keep going instead of generating an error. It would just say, okay, well, there's something out of whack here. I'll just keep looking till I find something that isn't a duplicate, and either that's doesn't appear to be working on this instance. Um, and so I mean, obviously you've rebuilt it and
yes.
it's still doing this. So there's something that we have to look. We thought we fixed it. We didn't. We'll fix it.
All right.
So,
Sounds good.
um, oops, sorry. This is the fake Augur minutes from before we changed to a single giant doc. These are the real ones. So any other questions, Adrian? Sounded like you may have had some.
I think I was more planning to just kind of demo some vibes I had. I've been thinking a lot about like I feel like I'm pivoting more from like actually making any contributions to Augur itself and just sort of focusing on this. Like it seemed like there was a need last time to do like how do we generate a stable identifier like this sort of like a genetic marker or fingerprint for a repository. And so that almost seems like to me that almost sounds like, hey, let's go write a whole new like separate program that then just gets included or used as part of Augur. And I've just been like looking into different like how I think actually I think Remy in the chat in the last couple of weeks was like sending me stuff like Software Heritage, how they do identifiers for their giant Git archives. Um,
So your
I
your aim is this identifier that would span any instance of Augur.
Potentially, yeah, I'm just kind of, and essentially I've been kind of zeroing in on like how do I like how can you kind of I think one of the things I've been looking at in the last couple days actually is like you guys we mentioned last time how there was like there's all these like metrics that are or these things that you can this information about a repository that we have that's like license, like URL, description, programming language, like it's stuff that's there and like somewhat useful, but it's like a bunch of tiny little pieces of data that are all subject to change. And that sort of reminded me of how web fingerprinting works, where like obviously your browser is sending all these tiny pieces of information that can't individually identify you, but the combination of all of them together can. And I imagine there's some technology there where they find a way that like, oh, even if your user agent changes in your browser, it can still tell that it's you. So like I kind of want to see if I can take that technology out of the creepy web tracking realm and see if I can apply it to this. But I've also been thinking of other ideas. And
But
like,
the goal isn't to be creepy, of course. The goal
yeah,
is to simply to have a, I guess you would characterize it as an independent identification scheme, so that regardless of what instance of Augur, you would generate the same identifier for the same repository.
yeah, and I think that particular part, I think I've not been super sure like how to guarantee like because I feel like especially with this sort of repository fingerprint, like eventually you're gonna have enough things be different where like it sort of has to generate a new identifier. Otherwise, everything has literally the exact same identifier. Um, even if it's a different repository. So it's like trying to find that balance and stuff. But yeah, I've just kind of been experimenting, like just putting a bunch of different like examples of identifier schemes in a doc just to try and organize them and just play around. So I was curious if people had ideas. Um,
So let me just assume that you're familiar with the platform identifier for each repository, that GitHub has an identifier that spans
I did
relocate.
look at the table. Yeah, I think I did see like the repo source ID. I think that
That's
it's
right.
just like an integer basically is
That's
all
right.
I saw. Yeah.
That's right. And so the platform, both GitHub and GitLab, and I suspect any platform providing an API does have an identifier for itself. that it keeps internal, and that identifier is robust against somebody moving it, changing ownership, whatever. It will always be that identifier as long as it is that repository object that's moving from org to org or being renamed. And so that's how we've solved the ensuring that each repository is unique, even when it moves.
Yeah, and so I was sort of thinking, like, obviously those are still useful. I was kind of, for that, I was sort of thinking about a concept that I heard of when I was contributing to some like scrapers to pull COVID vaccine availability from various places during the whole vaccine shortage of the pandemic. And I think one of the teams from California built this like massively crazy scraper system. Um, but they, in their database, because they were oftentimes pulling data from other scrapers that were already covering like the regional areas, they had this kind of concept in their database called concordances. So they were
Mhm.
essentially like, hey, here's our sort of unique identifier for this record, but hey, here's all the other identifiers this location is also known as in other people's data sets. So I almost
Uh,
wonder if that could be a like if having our own ID replaces the like repo source ID, but then we have like some way to still keep track of that GitHub and GitLab IDs for that repository. Um, Somehow. That's maybe I feel like that's maybe a little bit out of scope for I think what I'm probably gonna try and go for. I might
well,
just try and like generate the find just some way to like fingerprint a repository, but
one thing I can say just from lots of experience working with this data is the a lot of people rely on the URL uh, maintaining a degree of uniqueness, and that is mostly good, but it is not universally good, which is why we've moved to the platform identifier. So most data collection tools are going to just identify the repo by the URL, and that works until the repository is moved to another org or
yeah.
renamed. And then it's the same repository with a different name. The platform API will redirect you appropriately. And I see John and one other person has now raised their hand, so I will shut my pie hole.
I guess I will go first. So, one thing that stands out to me is the model that you're have been discussing over the past few minutes is essentially the model of federation. So, like you would see with a platform like Mastodon, for instance, and to a lesser extent, something like Blue Sky. Um, and I think that it's definitely an interesting concept, but the idea of a concordance or something of that matter, or um, there's another word for it that I think also comes to mind, but I can't quite think of it at this moment. That would usually entail some sort of cooperation between Augur instances talking to each other to sort of come to an agreement about like what the ID, what the globally unique ID for a repo is based upon the information that each instance has about that source. So, I think that it's definitely an interesting idea, but I think that going beyond information that is actually contained in the repo would maybe be a little out of scope for the Augur project itself.
Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, that's sort of I think yeah, that's where it kind of gets tricky. I'm sort of trying. I think I'm probably largely excluding that. I was just sort of thinking of that as a way to like, if these platform IDs are still useful to keep around, but maybe not as part of like the globally unique thing. But yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah, for collection, I think that repo source IDs are definitely going to be more important moving forward, especially as we come into a lot more edge cases with the data and as platforms start shifting stuff around in the future. Um, so I think from a collection standpoint, definitely they have shown themselves to be quite important because it's very difficult to get something from the platform that is like guaranteed, steadfast, good data that we know for a fact is like
A
um
robust identifier is
yeah,
important. I
exactly.
The scenario Adrian described, so I'm trying to think of where and how this could be Augur related, and I think and we see very little of this so far, but it's not to say that we won't see significantly more of it in the future. When a repository changes platform, so when, as has happened a few times, groups of repos move from GitHub to either GitLab or Bitbucket or something like that, we would have no way right now of knowing that it's the same repository. However, if we developed a signature like Adrian's describing using the commit log, then I think we would have enough information to distinguish repositories that are moved from one platform to another to identify them, because the commit log doesn't change. That is the one piece of a platform implementation that is unchanged. The commit hashes are all the same, and likely what's included in them is all the same, or at least largely the same, assuming some limited number of changes in the commit consolidation.
Yeah. That's one of the other ideas I think is probably one of the stronger ones too, is like I think I've taken a computer vision class in a previous semester, and there was some interesting algorithm that I think I was introduced to there about like rotation independent feature descriptors, I think, or whatever, something like that. Essentially, it can identify like, hey, this is the same image, or like you're looking at the same serial box between these two images, except one of them's like rotated 180 degrees.
Yeah, it's upside down. Yeah.
And it does some weird thing. I don't know exactly how it works. I can't remember exactly how it works now, but it does some like thing where it finds like key points and then sort of looks radially around that point and sort of creates like a little signature of like, hey, here's the direction where it's most linear or something, and then it can kind of like turn that into a little graph and then sort of shift around sort of the bars of the bar chart to like normal, sort of put them in a known order, like starting from a certain rotation, so you kind of ignore all that. So I was essentially kind of thinking, can I apply the same idea to a repository where like you do like maybe several like graphs of like, hey, like lines changed per commit, where the x-axis is like the no, like the commit, they like each commit in order of time, or just like other things like that of like line like various metrics that you kind of over time, and sort of use that to create like a signature of like some kind of thing similar to kind of how if anyone knows how like Shazam does like audio identification.
I
I don't
don't.
know. I think it essentially converts the song to like the spectrogram and then looks at like points on that are like hot, like sort of high contrast or
Yeah.
whatever the word is, and then kind of uses sort of figures out like which of those, like it takes the entire sort of amount of data and just condenses it down to like basically a scatter plot, and then it like is like, okay, we only care about things in this range, or pick this key point and pick like a period of time after it, and then we like take that little signature and slide it through like basically their entire data set to find where does it most strongly match, like in the middle of a song or something like that. So I'm almost wondering if something similar to that could be useful.
I mean, certainly the patterns of how many lines per commit, they remain unchanged as well as the hash
Yeah.
itself. So, and you could, unlike the hash, you could use that to discern a pattern over time, which I think is
Yeah.
what you're describing.
And I was also thinking of doing like potentially doing it over the files in the repository too. So like even if maybe if we wanted to be robust to like if someone's like just squashing an entire repository into one commit to like fork it, but not fork it properly,
Mhm.
um, maybe it could kind of look at like the tree of files in the repository and some sort of metric on those of like, hey, like can we kind of take the structure of files and sort of create an identifier from that, and maybe use that in combination with one of the other ones or something.
And yeah, in Augur, so of course the commit table maintains that record for each file in each repository for the commit. If you're looking for, okay, here's a state at a point in time of a repository, and here's the file structure, independent of the commit registered temporal change over time, you could use the repo underscore labor table. That table also enumerates, but not sequentially as terms of changes. It just enumerates every single file in the repository and the language, the number of lines, the complexity using Kokomo. So that the repo labor table, I think, probably produces a signature like the one that you're describing right now.
All right, that's
Well, I see
interesting.
your hand's been up for a while.
Yeah, mine's kind of a sidebar. Two things on the repo. I like the identifier. I just wanted to make sure that this is intended behavior. I was looking at the logs and looking at one of the error repositories, and it was the link was the old link. Like once you put it into like a search bar, like GitHub rerouted it. But I'm assuming like Augur just keeps the original URL and assigns and uses that route like pretty much the unique identifier, and that's how it finds its new location.
Right. So the what you're describing is, I think, the pull request errors that you see.
I don't even remember. I just remember that I was like copying and pasting some repositories into my search bar just to see what their structure was like. And I just noticed it was one of the Apache ones. And yeah, Apache moves. I was just like, oh, sounds about right. Um, that was one thing. I just wanted to make sure that was the attended behavior. And two, I my theory on this error is that it's direct what's causing it, or not even causing it, but what's making these repositories uniquely a problem is that there's no new activity. And so whatever workaround would probably work for repositories and was working for repositories that has any type of new activity since the last time it was collected on. Pretty much every single one of these repositories have like little to no issues, like have little to no data in general, but are a lot of times archived or have not been worked on in years. And so that's kind of my theory at this point, what's probably still causing that like it's not it's
Do we think
looking
they've
for
been do we think they've been moved or renamed?
not all of them, no, but it just seems like if it's looking for, okay, we know the first one might not be like we already have something, but it's looking for what's new. In a lot of these cases there is nothing that's new.
I see.
There's this very specific error state in older databases where before we implemented the repo move logic, you might have two copies of the same repo in your database, one which uses the old URL and one which uses the new URL. And we have seen many conflicts where in on inserts it will try to update parts of the repo with sort of the source ID, and it might be that the source ID already exists on one of the repos and not on the other, even though they're the same one.
Yeah, that would make sense for the ones that we do have duplicates. A lot of these errors there is no duplicate. I guess that was a lot of the ones I'm referring to that are like archives or older. I don't think that I know not all of them are
So
duplicates. I think the vast majority of them aren't. But it could be some of the cases, but I don't think it's all 10,000.
yeah, that number is extraordinarily high, and so we've got to look at your specific instance and see what's going on there. Um, now so I think you are describing two different things. The first one that John described is basically, or I think you and John both described. I'm sorry, I'm darting about trying to find the way to share something here. Hopefully you can read this. So whenever there's a pull request, that pull request itself does have a URL, and there's when a repository moves, we're going to update the in the like a year-old version of Augur, we would update the repo URL and the repo table and not address this data, which would automatically sort of just get reshaped. But what happened was, and most of the occurrences of this are actually things that I did, where I would go back and, for example, re-add Apache, and we hadn't protected against the sequence of events where I would re-add Apache effectively to get all of the repos that we didn't previously have. And what it would do is insert ones for which we did not have an existing URL. And where that would cause problems is if Apache had moved the repository and our repo move logic hadn't been executed before I tried to insert that quote unquote new repository, which was really just a moved repository. The current version of Augur deals with that condition. Databases that are older than a year, like the one that I run and the one that you run, Callie, we have some of these issues that need to be deduped or sorted out, where the URL changed, but we didn't gather the source ID before that, and we ended up with a second copy of it. And where we see the most issues with that is around this PR URL, where the pull request is looking at, two pull requests are looking at exactly the same URL because they're both looking at the relocated URL, and it's finding this is already in the database, so it's treating it like a duplicate, which is what we want because it's surfaced this issue with collection. And so as we've discussed before, there's a piece of logic we need to do to dedupe existing databases like ours. In the second case of the event stuff, I'm not sure that's the same thing.
Yeah, that's what I was about to say. Is I just went and grabbed the first error that I saw, and I was like, "Yep, that's exactly." They all kind of have the same exact, not the same exact, but it's like usually they're an archive. There's not anything that's been done in them for a while being over a year, if not
Yeah.
more. And so I just think that the logic might not be taking in that there just might not be any new events that have happened since the last collection.
So nothing would
Um,
trigger us to recognize that it had moved, for example.
there's no, I'm not, there is, these repos have not moved. We're not
Mhm.
talking about movement anymore.
Right. They're
Uh,
empty, basically. They've had no new activity and they're archived.
yeah, there are no new activity. They're archived, but because all of their last collection date got put to null, if the logic is to be like, okay, if the first one's already been collected, check the next. It's never going to reach an event that it hasn't seen before.
Right. Yeah, I know the ones you're talking about. They're basic. In most cases, these are mirrors where the actual source code is kept somewhere else, and there's just a copy of it on GitHub or GitLab. And
Yes.
yeah, so that's where we're seeing that specific issue, and so I have to
Yeah,
that
'cause that's where I could see the logic of what Andrew did break. Is that if it is assuming that there will eventually be a new event.
right. Yeah, that's definitely something I'll bring up with Andrew when I talk with him I guess tomorrow night.
Sounds good.
Yes.
I'll either open a pull if there's not already an issue for this, I'll open an issue for this and write this out so then I can put a couple of examples in and so then he like their full details are there for when he goes and works on it.
Thank you. That'd be very helpful. I think sometimes obviously if I'm translating for Andrew, it's better if I don't have to do that.
Also, I was gonna ask, like, I noticed when you were showing the database table earlier, it looked like there was a lot of different fields that include just a full URL.
That's true.
Um, is is that just because that's an old database that's been around for over a year, or like is it still current practice to store the full URL in several places? Because I feel like that's just several places that need to get updated if the repository moves,
Right.
and it might be better to just have the API generate those on the fly from just the repository URL, and then you store like the PR ID or the comment ID or whatever is needed to assemble
Yeah.
that URL.
So in any system that's essentially a data engineering system like Augur, there's always going to be this trade-off between programmatic, I'll say convenience, but I don't mean it pejoratively, programmatic convenience and ensuring data provenance. So the reason that we store all those URLs I can go back to that. they do represent something distinct. It's also the storage of, so for example, this is the URL itself via the API. Here is the HTML version of the URL. Here's a URL for the diff. If I can move this. For the diff, if it's a patch, there's the patch URL. And so issue, if there's always a corresponding issue with a pull request on GitHub. And then the source number is, this is the sequence number on it, it's state. So the reason that we store all this information is because, well, first the API provides it. And by storing it discretely, we also have a very clear record of what the data was when we collected it. Same reason we produce the data collection date, so that we know what date we gathered the data in a particular row, so that we can then deconstruct it and explain the provenance in most cases. So even when we have errors, like we've been discussing, it's the keeping of this provenance that enables us to go back and be very certain about what broke and how to fix it. And so, so from a programmatic perspective, it's got utility for that purpose. But from a, I'm going to make, so what I really, like my center of my universe is, and really the reason that we started Augur 8 years ago is because when I was looking at other data collection tools, there was no provenance. It would just change to whatever the present state was every time. And when there were issues or things that got moved or deleted, there was no record of that in our system. So I had no way of explaining why the data had changed or what kinds of events preceded the change of the data. Whereas every time the data has changed, these additional fields that you see here have been helpful for basically ensuring near 100% confidence that I understand what happened. So when a repo moves, like the first signal we had that we weren't that we had this condition where if the system didn't automatically detect the repo move before somebody tried to re-add the repo on its new URL, we would end up with a duplicate. We were able to sort of sort that logic out because we kept, it was the PR, it was this URL here in this column, this PR URL. This is what would error first. So when we had that condition, all of a sudden we would start to see errors where this pull request also already exists. And by looking into it, I was able to see, well, this pull request already exists because this repo moved and we already had it under the new URL. And while in some cases it would keep the old version, it would always try to update to the new version. So eventually we would end up with a condition where two repos were trying to store the same URL, even though they had different URLs in the repo table, and that would be because the repo had moved. And so that's a way or a reason why it's a condition that we can detect that other open source tools that look at this kind of data don't ever even notice. They would just mostly overwrite the history that existed before, and you wouldn't see these issues, and you wouldn't have these issues either, but you also wouldn't know that something moved. You wouldn't have a record of that. And it's that provenance that gives me confidence to make claims about the things that are in the data, if that makes sense. So obviously I'm approaching this from I want to have robust and defensible research data, and the same rules that I apply to get that are also helpful for, on the downside, generating some of the errors that we're seeing, and on the upside, making it possible for us to know exactly where those errors originate from. Does that make sense, or am I just blabbering now?
Yeah, that makes sense. I think that definitely kind of helps also with my project as well. Like, I'm wondering, like, if instead of trying to maybe replace like the repo source ID or something, it would just be helpful to add like a new, maybe just add a new like repository content ID or something. And it's like, hey, this is an identifier generated based on the content of the repository, so you can see, oh, we've already got a repository that's similar to this.
Yeah,
Like it could
okay.
kind of be another thing to query on instead of trying to replace
On it,
anything.
okay. As
Oh,
a
I'm
sidebar
getting that.
use case of that would be, instead of us like people try to put in like mirrors, not even mirrors, but like forks. And so being able to be like, well, this already like I don't know exactly how to use that, but the being able to know what repositories that are all are coming from the same like source, from the same, like our forks from the same place, is like would be useful. I don't know exactly how to use it yet, but with all these like repositories that we're seeing right now that are causing a lot of the errors, they're actually, most of them are like forks or things that are not, that don't have like a super, like a lot of activity on them.
Yeah, and that's one of the things I've been kind of looking at too. Is like I think some of the in investigating some of the browser fingerprinting stuff, I was kind of coming across the idea of like fuzzy hashes, where it's like it's not meant to be like a cryptographic hash where any bit that changes in the entire ID is different, but like it's almost like hashes that you can sort of do like, is it like Levenstein distance, or like you can kind of compare them based on kind of string similarity to see, oh, how similar are these repositories? Because I imagine like if you've got a fork, like I think the Flutter community has forked Flutter from Google just so they can iterate faster or whatever. And so it's like that code bit, that fork is going to be starting to diverge. And so at a certain point, it probably becomes its own thing. But like, where do you define that line and stuff like that? But
I
yeah,
will
that's a.
say,
Oh, go ahead.
I will say that when I first joined the Augur project, one of the very first things I brought up was the not normalized status of the database. I do think, and I do believe that it would be probably a really good idea to tend towards normalization to get rid of a lot of the sort of duplicated data that we see in a lot of the columns.
You think
Um,
the URLs being mostly the same, John?
yeah, I think that the different parts of the URL, maybe we could store them separately. And instead of having the same, like,
Like store base
five or
URL and then like here's the PR ID, here's the comment ID. Like so you
Yeah.
can
yeah.
still, it's still stored in the same row, but you can save a
Yeah,
little
as a
bit of data storage.
as a database guy, I would say it's normalized that each of these URLs, while largely redundant, do represent a discrete piece of information. But that's more academic in an argument form, not a pragmatic one.
It's
So
not 4NF, I can tell you that much.
no,
Um,
yeah, it's I strive for third normal form. I think um
yeah.
that's the reasonable trade-off between perfect would be perfect fifth normal form normalization and
Mhm.
utility. Um,
In terms of forks, from a GitHub perspective, there is certainly there are certainly mechanisms in place to sort of make that identification. But from a Git standpoint, the only indication that one repository is a fork of another is the common Git history. So, really, I guess if you were to sort of want
we
to
have a
calculate,
there is a fork flag in the repo table.
yeah, GitHub does maintain that information. But if you're just talking from like a Git log standpoint, which is going back to the
Oh, right, yeah.
information we were talking about earlier from like the universal ID, the only sort of indication that a repository is a fork of another repository is that they share some common Git history, right? So,
Well,
um,
we do store like when a repository is forked, we do share where it's forked from.
mhm, yeah,
So, but to your point, that's still not perfect. If we stored some kind of signature like Adrian's describing, then we would be able to detect, for example, hostile forks or forks that are created or cloned from one repository and then re-uploaded to another repository. So that these, yeah,
to
cross.
Callie's point, yeah, if we rely on the GitHub mechanism for determining a fork, then that doesn't work on every platform.
That's
I
right.
liked the idea, Adrian, that you brought up about using sort of the fuzzy hashes or like the distance sort of calculation to calculate like how different are these two Git logs. Like maybe if the difference between them is 100%, they share no common commit history. And then maybe the difference between them is like 75%, meaning that it was forked recently. Maybe the difference between them is like 40%, meaning that they were forked a long time ago, or maybe one of the repos is no longer maintained and the other fork has been continued to be maintained. So I think that that's actually a pretty good idea. Now I have brought up in the past the fact that the Git log is very malleable and cannot be relied upon as a source of truth indefinitely, but it does definitely provide some amount of historical information, assuming no malintent.
No, and in
Um,
fact, and to your point, John, I just want to point, in two cases, we've identified clear malintent where there were attempts um, to take a repository with the same commit history and the same logic and squash a whole bunch of commits and make it not look like the same repository. And somewhere along the line, it caused us a problem.
Can I have those repositories? Because that would be a really
Uh,
helpful test case.
if I could find them. I have to confess, I didn't make a careful record. It was like, I remember vaguely it was last fall that we were sitting in my office and were running across this. And it was before we had fully diagnosed the larger issue of moving repositories. And John, you had broken down a commit log, and we were seeing the commit log being basically the same for two very different repositories. Do you remember that?
Oh, like it was they made a fork, but they cloned and pushed it instead of using the fork UI in GitHub.
Yeah.
mhm.
And they also squashed a bunch of commits where it just like the commit, I can't, do you remember this, John? It was like the commit history just like stopped and then restarted. I mean, it looked like somebody had done something funky with it. Do you remember this at all?
I it's not coming to
Okay.
mind. But one thing I will point out is that the GitHub interface does push squashing quite a lot.
Yeah.
They put squash buttons all over the place for PRs, for merge requests, for all the different sort of things. So having the GitHub interface sort of just lead a user into squashing commits is not at all unusual. And that's another issue is that um, a squash commit will sort of interfere with your ability to sort of maybe calculate the difference between two different repos. Because from a git log standpoint, it might not necessarily look identical, even if it is.
Yeah.
Yeah,
So we have
I
four.
have a couple of notes on this just from what I've seen in projects that I've worked on. So most of the big forks that happen are almost never use that fork button on GitHub. So if you're talking about like a hostile fork,
Mhm.
like OpenSearch or OpenTofu or Valky, none of them used the forking mechanism on GitHub. They all were basically created as new repositories with the data brought in from Git. So I can tell you that's a pretty common use case, at least with hostile forks. And then I can also say that what John was saying about the squash commits is totally true. Within a lot of the CNCF projects, it's actually they won't merge it unless it gets squashed because they basically if I work on something for 5 days and I've got 10 commits, they don't care about that. They don't want to see those 10 commits. They want to see the one commit where you packaged everything together. So, it's been true in Kubernetes for years. We do it in a lot of the other CNCF projects as well, because it keeps from our perspective, it keeps the repository a little bit cleaner because you don't end up with we've all seen the commit history. Well, we've all done the commit history where it's like, oh, I fixed the thing. Nope, wait a minute. Here's the commit that really fixes it. Nope, wrong again. And they don't want that in the
Yeah.
commit log.
I imagine the commit log would get to be terabytes in size at some point on a project like Kubernetes too. That makes sense.
Yeah. So anyways, just a couple of data points from what I've seen.
Thank you, Don. No, those are very good points. And I think they speak to the utility of the kind of signature that Adrian's suggesting. We got about a minute left here. Adrian, I see your hand up.
Yeah, I was just gonna say, Dawn, in those cases with those three hostile forks you mentioned, are the commit history is still there, right? Like the initial commit of both repositories is still the same. Because I think Git internally or GitHub internally, like stores those repositories in like the same tree or some weird structure like that, so they can save space. Like I'd be curious, like, do those have the same source ID in?
I don't,
Actually,
you
it's
know what?
probably like
I
if
don't
Git's
know
doing
because
that.
I didn't look at that. What I was looking at was I was trying to figure out the date that they forked, that they actual forked it, not the date that they announced it, which is what I had been using. And what I realized was that they weren't using the GitHub fork mechanism, but you could tell because the GitHub repository was created on a certain date, and then all of the history was imported in after the repository was created. So I assume they imported all of the commits, but I don't know exactly how they did that. Do you want me to send you the URLs of those just for
I think I
comparison?
found them. I've got a little spreadsheet going of examples. Actually, yeah, those might be helpful. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, I can send you that.
All right, and we are out of time, but thank you for an awesome discussion, everyone. I learned a lot. Hope you all did too. And I will see you next time we augur.
Yes, thanks everyone.
All right, bye.
Bye bye.